Hello everybody, my name is Katie Martin and I chose to do my course project on the Civil Rights Movement. The Civil Rights Movement was a movement for equality that began in the 1950s and 1960s. This was characterized by a split of the North and South, especially after the Civil War when the South lost and they were forced to put an end to slavery. The South wanted to keep this status quo, and since they could not actually put the African Americans into slavery anymore, they created what was called black codes. These were a set of laws in the South that worked to oppress the African Americans. For example, one black code actually stated how marriage between a white and a black was a felony that resulted in life imprisonment. Because the U.S. had just ended a war over this very subject, they had to enact legislation to stop the deprivation of rights to any person, and this became known as the Civil Rights Act of 1866. This teeter-totter effect continued with African Americans being given rights and them being taken away by Southerners with the Southern Acts of 1894. These acts denied African Americans rights to any public accommodations such as restaurants, hotels, and swimming pools. Because of the 14th Amendment, the court could not protect these people from this, as they could only be protected from official actions under the law. This in turn opened up a whole new form of degradation because white Southerners beat and harassed the African Americans with little to no punishment at all. Jackie Robinson wrote a letter to President Eisenhower that 17 million Negroes cannot do as you suggest and wait for the hearts of men to change. We want to enjoy now the rights that we feel we are entitled to as Americans. This we cannot do unless we pursue aggressive goals which all other Americans achieved over 150 years ago. This was significant because it expresses African American attitudes towards waiting for change that may or may not ever happen. At this time, a large number of white people were so racially fixed that they did not even want to live among blacks, let alone let them be free and equal. In fact, Creedy and Fawcett did a study in 1998 and found that Southern whites' school enrollment in public schools steadily declined in the 1960s and 1970s as desegregation progressed. The study was able to hold its ground on the basis of racism due to the large African American populations in these places with the most Southern white withdrawal. These Southerners were successful in their removal of white students from public schools, as they were then able to place their children within nice private schools. Because of the white withdrawal in the South, many public schools closed, leaving no education for the African Americans. Although the Civil Rights Act of 1875 seemed like a huge breakthrough for civil rights, there were some fatal flaws within it. The interpretation of this bill was such that if separate schools were supported and they were equal, then it would not be in violation of the law. Therefore, separate schools were created, but they were far from equal. Black schools received fewer resources per student, teacher salaries were actually lower, school terms were shorter, and class sizes were larger. Although Congress supported and pushed racial integration, they let this separate but equal slogan slide for as long as they possibly could. Congress was finally forced to reach a decision and made their mark in 1954. The Brown versus Topeka case officially declared the separate but equal facilities unconstitutional, and desegregation was to be ran as a state action. This court decision also took the first real aim at ending Jim Crow segregation. In 1960, however, the racial tensions and divisions were still present predominantly among the South. In fact, 56 court cases were pending on the protest of school segregation in 13 southern and border states. Ultimately, Brown versus Topeka led to a series of civil rights legislations and forms of massive resistance. Due to the attempts to segregate all public accommodations, especially within the educational system, massive resistance and protests were created by African Americans. On the flip side, many white Southerners turned to brutality, authorities, and officials for help with the resistance to desegregation. This was present in the suppression of civil rights demonstrations. In fact, there were actual televised scenes of policemen letting dogs loose, using tear gas, beating the demonstrators and using high-pressure fire hoses to actually clear them out. These demonstrations were usually peaceful, and officials used these extremes to get the peaceful demonstrators to stop. The resistance continued with the issue of the Central High in Little Rock, Arkansas. When 9 black students tried to enroll to this public school, they were denied access. This became a critical moment in the act of school desegregation because President Eisenhower had a big decision to make. The government of Arkansas had actually called in National Guard soldiers to keep black students out of the schools. Eisenhower responded this by sending home the National Guard. He then brought the U.S. Army Airborne Division in to make sure that the African American students were not denied their rights. Resistance furthered for these students once they were inside due to the teachers and white students actually yelling and spitting at them to get out. And this is just a picture of Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas, and you can see all of the military personnel there. Protests continued among African Americans and supporters with sit-ins and freedom rides. These were most prevalent in Birmingham, Alabama, as it was the most segregated city in the 1960s. This resistance was particularly aimed at breaking up the whites-only lunch counters. African Americans would actually go in and sit there in protest to prove their point on public places being desegregated. These protests proved successful with the freedom rides as they nearly bankrupted the bus systems. These buses relied on the African Americans for their money as they were the most prominent customers. By removing barriers such as Jim Crow laws and voting restrictions, educating each other, and enforcement of the laws, African Americans were able to fully integrate into society. Northerners adjusted to race relations much better than the Southerners did. However, with education and black organization groups, the race relations improved in the South as well. Although society has made many strides for civil rights and the treatment of African Americans has come a long ways, unfortunately there are still people in our country who are very racist. Groffman actually did a study and found that although most whites now support racial equality in the United States, many still remain unfavorable to the federal government's enforcement of equal opportunity in employment, to its enforcement of integration in public schools, and to open housing. However, there is hope for the future that racial tensions will continue to improve, as younger whites are more supportive than older whites of efforts to improve the status of blacks. Race is a social construction that has nothing to do with biological factors. In other words, race is something that society as a whole has created throughout the years. Society created this as a way to organize everyone into their own specific groups. Racism in today's modern society has come a long ways as there are generally more passive racists than active ones. The main thing that people often see is individual unconscious racism. These people often do not even realize that they are taking part in racism as they laugh at a racist joke, see a person of color and become extra cautious, or see themselves as simply superior. All in all, racism and rights of people of color have come a long way from slavery and segregation to freedom and integration. Although most people in society still have quite a ways to go before racism is completely eradicated from our country, it has greatly improved. Hopefully, with more education on this subject of racism and how it affects any person regardless of their skin color, society can work towards completely solving this issue for good. And these are just my references.